What's up, guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello. My name is Erica, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, I am chatting to an absolute British icon. He is most well known for appearing on our TV screens, as well as in films and in theatre. He's published many fiction books, as well as his own memoirs, and has hosted popular TV shows, including QI, as well as the newly adapted Jeopardy here in the UK. So that can only mean one thing. And today I am chatting to the unbelievable Stephen Fry. Now today, despite all of that, we are going to be focusing on some of my favorite Greek myth retellings, titled Mythos, Heroes, and Troy. Given that this is a Classics YouTube account, it only seems right that we focus there and we really get into, the nitty-gritty of the Greek myths, what inspires you, and all of that fun stuff. But first things first, Stephen, thank you so much for joining me today on the channel.
Yes, indeed. It's an absolute pleasure, I promise you.
So I like to start all of my interviews with context. So I always think that classics context is so important to understanding the classicist or the historian, the author, whoever. So can you take me back to 5-6-year-old Stephen Fry growing up in Norfolk and reading Tales from Ancient Greece?
Yes, you've got it absolutely in one. It was before I had been exposed to Latin and Greek as languages at school. And it was a book that was amongst tales of Robin Hood and I seem to remember some Russian folk tales. There was this book by L.S. Hyde, which was the stories of Greek and Roman myth, and I was absolutely entranced by them, more than by the others. Impossible to explain why. I mean, the older you get, the more mysterious it is when you look back at the things that triggered one's excitement, kindled lifelong interests. I mean, for example, it's off-piste, but I remember my brother and I were in the room at the same time when my father happened to have on his gramophone Wagner's Tannhäuser overture. And my brother was kind of like, yeah. And I was entranced. And the lifelong love of that rogue Wagner has pursued me ever since. But my brother and I, more or less the same DNA and upbringing, he chose the path that most people did of his generation, Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin and so on. Not that I dislike them, and it's the same with these stories. Some people at the same time were starting to read The Hobbit and becoming entranced by the legendarium, I think is the word that Tolkien used of his myth building. That's never appealed to me. I don't know why. I don't despise it. I was in a film, two films of The Hobbit that Peter Jackson made, and very good fun it was too. But that thing inside that is lit up isn't lit up for me by Tolkien or George R.R. Martin or the modern myth makers, if you like. Although I would say, and we'll probably talk about this, these are not myths. There's something very different when they are authored individually. But for me, it was those Greek stories, and I just had to hear the word Hermes or Athena, and I was kind of, and I'm sure you're the same when you're watching University Challenge or some quiz show, and you hear it's a mythology is the subject, you immediately perk up and think, that's my home, that's my wheelhouse, as they say. It's been ever thus. Of course, as I got older, in my 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, living a life of work and far away from the Greek myths, really, apart from the odd book that would come out or new translation of Homer or something that I would always be keenly interested in. And it's really interesting, again, this may be something you want to talk about. Whenever it was, 5-6 years ago, I was at a dinner party and I can't remember why the subject came around, and I started talking about Kronos and Uranus and then Zeus and how he was born and how Rhea tricked Kronos and so on. And everybody stared at me. And they said, well, I kind of knew about Zeus, but that was how he was born. And he was born last but first. And what is, and they were going, this is amazing. How do you know this? And I said, well, I just remember it from when I was fascinated, in the same way you probably remember the lineup of Manchester United in 1968. You know, you could probably go Charlton, Best, Kidd, Styles. You know, you don't, it's kind of the same mechanism. And I wouldn't want to aggrandize oneself because it happens to be something as storied, as Americans would say, as Greek myth. It's part of that childhood passion. Anyway, they all said, "Oh, you should." And I looked and I saw that nobody had really retold the tales in the way that my heroes like Ellis Hyde and Robert Graves and you know, Edith Hamilton, yep, and others had done. But over that period, really interestingly, I produced this book Mythos, which was, you know, sort of took the reader from the theogony, if you want to be grand about it, all the way really through to, you know, Pandora, Prometheus, and some of the earliest myths of gods and humans interacting, and Arachne and stories like that. And then I noticed that there was this new wave of classicists, mostly women, actually. Madeline Miller and Bethany Hughes and Natalie, and of course now Emma Wilson with her extraordinary translations of Homer, Pat Barker. There were really a marvelous kind of new retelling of the Greek myths. A lot of it, of course, to do with finding a voice for women in these stories, and these very, you know, you think of the average picture on the front of a Greek myth book, and it's probably a man in a brazen helmet, you know, looking really warrior-like. Or if it is a woman, it's a woman being swooped down on, and to use the sort of Victorian word, ravished by one of the gods. And so, you know, there's been a huge need for that reclamation of women within myth, and an understanding of what the female spirit and instinct meant to the Greeks. I mean, I don't think it's an accident that the dodecathon, the 12 gods of Olympus, are 6 gods and 6 goddesses. So it's not that the Greeks were all just warrior people who reduced women to a particular role. Though in Athens, there is an element of that, of course, once we get to historical Greece. But in mythical Greece, which is a very different thing, whatever the reality of life might have been like in the Minoan age or any of the Mycenaean or any of these ages, and that we assume are sort of vaguely intermingled with the creation of these myths, whatever the real life of women and slaves might have been, that extraordinary collective unconscious is the Jungian phrase, that creates myth, is wiser and more instinctively understanding of the nature of humanity and life than any particular polity or social system that is being undergone at the time of the myth being created, if you see what I mean. Myths that have a wide understanding of humanity can come out of a society that is quite narrowly hierarchical. And in a sense, myths are a dream breaking through. I think Joseph Campbell, about whom I'm sure we can all have problems, but nonetheless hugely influential and interesting, if a bit dogmatic about the meaning of story. I think he called myths public dreams, which is rather a good phrase. And it certainly, and I'm giving a very long answer to your question, but anyway, that's
okay.
what completed the circle for me, was realizing that this childhood passion of mine was something that could be shared anew, and that it wasn't part of the schoolroom, in the same way that classics are not part of the schoolroom. They're so associated. In my mind, I mean, if we wanted to move forward, when I was 7, I was sent away to boarding school, 200 miles from home, and it was an era of what we now call, in very very bold inverted commas, a classical education, which is to say Latin very early on. And I loved it. It was like playing a code game. I just thought it was so thrilling that a word, with an inflected language, a word could contain the different meanings according to its endings. And this idea of conjugation, which was anathema to so many sitting around me, they just stared in horror, much as I did with maths. But with Latin, for some reason, it just clicked and I loved it. And I was so advanced in it, I suppose, if I want to be boastful about it, that the Latin master, Mr. Knight, said to me that perhaps I'd be interested in learning Greek. And by this time I was 8, possibly 9. And again, I fell on it like a lion on on a lamb. The thrill of learning, new characters for the alphabet, and so sort of teaching friends and swapping notes and so on, and that endless fascination with etymology, with I remember this book that I was given to, you'd get phoneme and grammane and whatever, and be told that to write, but to read and to make noises, so graphane and grammane and phoneme, and you do telegraph and telegram and grammar, and they give you the English words, and you go, oh yes, that's interesting. Gosh, phobosphere, and oh yes, yeah, that makes sense, and then I remember one chapter, the word thaumadze, and this is easily remembered by thinking of the English word thaumaturge. I remember looking at it and going, what? And I did crawl off to a dictionary and look up thaumaturge, and there it was, a worker of wonders, miracle worker, and thaumadzo means to marvel at, to
And now
wonder.
you know it.
And now I know it, so it did work.
Look at that. It comes full circle.
Yeah. Though I have to confess to absolute cowardice, I didn't take it on to degree level, either Latin or Greek.
So I wanted to ask you about this because in your book, I read also your memoirs.
Oh, gosh.
And you wrote something really interesting where you said that you liked ancient history too, which was actually a cop-out. I should have chosen Latin and Greek, but I saw ancient history as a good dossy compromise. Why?
Well, particles, I think, when it comes to Greek. I loved reading Greek, but in those days, it was the case for A levels as well as in Cambridge, certainly, and not in Oxford, I think. But I'm not sure about the other universities that have big classical schools. It was necessary, if you were doing Latin or Greek, to do what were known in those days, I don't know what they call them now, proses and unseens. An unseen is where you get given a piece in the foreign language and you translate it into English, and it's obviously unseen. And it's that way around. So you get a piece of Latin and you get a piece of Greek and you translate it to English. And I could do that and I liked it. But then the other way around, the proses, where you get a piece of English and you have to translate it into Latin, which I would find slightly easier than doing it into Greek because of those wretched particles, the little words in Greek, and things like the middle. Is it middle a mood or
we don't talk about that here.
Yeah, exactly. All that detail, exactly, because it puts people off. It becomes the sort of technical side, and it locks away so much of the juice and energy of the period and of the people and of the stories they tell and the literature they wrote and the thoughts they thought and the battles they fought, and the whole wonder of the ancient world suddenly becomes a technical issue of translation and fustiness somehow, which is not to say one doesn't admire people who do deeply go into the language and so on. But that's not all of what classical studies is by any means, but it slightly was in the past. There was, if you were a true classicist, you learned Latin and Greek. And by the way, my friends at university who were doing classics, and my very closest friend, in fact, it's not only that you did, when you wrote a prose, that you say you would get a Time leader from that day's newspaper, and you had to translate it into Latin. But it wasn't just Latin, it had to be, you were told which sort, this is going to be Tacitan, please, or this is going to be Ciceronian. And you had to use phrases and constructions and formulae that were used by those writers, and Tacitus in particular, very difficult. He would use a lot of what I believe are called meiosis or litotes, these not inconsiderable, or haud inscius, anybody might remember in Latin, which means not unknowing. So it's his way of saying fully aware. Caesar was fully aware. He would always say Caesar was not unknowing. So if you were translating a piece of English into that and you came across the phrase fully aware and you put fully aware in Latin, the don, the person supervising your teacher, your tutor, would say, I don't think there's an example of Tacitus using that phrase, is there? And he would pull down a book. And if it was Greek, it would be Thucydidean. You have to write it in Thucydidean Greek. And again, if you used a phrase that wasn't Thucydidean, the don would say, where is your citation for that particular phrase? I say gnoimein. I don't think we find that, do we? And we might in Herodotus, but I don't think we do in Thucydides. Now, this sounds absolutely insane as a discipline, phenomenal. I mean, just extraordinary. But in this, this is the old way that teaching used to be. It's a bit like, actually, at Cambridge, the finals, the exams you take are called the tripos. And they're called the tripos because you used to sit on a three-legged stool for the inquisition of the examinations. And say if you are reading mathematics at Cambridge, the top first class degree, the most successful student, undergraduate in maths of that year, is known as the senior wrangler. And a wrangler level is first, and then you're an optime and a junior optime. And that's because they literally would sit on these stools and wrangle. So in Isaac Newton's day, he would sit on a stool and they would wrangle. In later, for classics, you would sit on a stool and speak in classics, which reminds me of a great Oscar Wilde story that your listeners, I hope, will enjoy. He was a brilliant classicist, Oscar. I mean, truly brilliant. One of the best that Trinity College Dublin had produced under their tutor, who was a famous classics professor called Mahaffy, and who sent Wilde to Magdalen, Oxford, with glowing reports of this young man. And indeed, Wilde won many, many prizes. And I've been to the Clark Library here in Los Angeles, where I am, where they have his lecture notes that he took when he was a student, and he would write them in Greek or Latin. So he was listening to the lecture and he would translate in real time, and you could read them and you would just go, wow. Because he'd sometimes put in brackets what the English phrase was that the professor had used. But that's how fluent he was in both languages. But in those days, you had what were known as viva exams, viva voce, live voice. In other words, rather than sitting writing an essay, you'd go and do it in front of a panel of professors. And there was always an element of that. And he was doing a viva to show that he was familiar with New Testament Greek. Your listeners might be aware that the whole New Testament, every book of the New Testament, from Matthew to Revelations, is written in Greek, not in Hebrew or Aramaic, but in Greek. And it's a later Greek than the Greek of Socrates, Sophocles, and all those. And so he had to show a familiarity with it. So he was handed a New Testament Bible in its original Greek, and opened a page that's sort of random and asked to translate. And the page was at the Passion and Crucifixion of Christ. And so he opened it and he started to read completely fluently and perfectly. And they said, thank you, Mr. Wilde. And he carried on reading this translation. And they said, Mr. Wilde, you can stop it. And then he carried on. So Mr. Wilde stopped. He said, oh, please let me go on. I'm just dying to find out how it all ends. Just very naughty in a very deeply Christian era. But so, yeah, I mean, this is it. And of course, classics, both historical classics, the lives of Caesar and his, the Suetonius, the successive Claudian emperors, and all the way up through the wicked and wonderful ones, and the Heliogabalus, or however he's pronounced these days, and all of these were second nature to. They were a bit like football teams that to people of the Victorian and Edwardian era. They knew references all the time, and in their poetry and in their writing, you hear about it. And sometimes you get a reference that is very classical, but because of its use has now become everyday for us. So I was thinking of a good example. I was doing an audiobook not long ago of Great Expectations, the Charles Dickens novel. And there's a bit in it where Pip, the hero, is reading a newspaper article from his local town where he grew up when he was a poor blacksmith's adopted son. And Dickens makes great play of imitating the ridiculously high-flown style of the local newspaper. And it's the story that they're trying to tell is how this awful man called Pumblechook had been the sponsor of Pip into his leap into fortune, which we discovered, of course, wasn't true. But Pumblechook was convinced it was through his actions that Pip became rich young man. And he put in it this mentor to young Telemachus, and the mentor was in inverted commas. And now we use the word mentor all the time without probably being aware that mentor was a character in the Odyssey who did help and tutor Telemachus, the son of Odysseus. And the newspaper article, the Telemachus didn't need to be in inverted commas. It was obvious to anybody reading who Telemachus was. He was the young son of Odysseus. But mentor had to be in inverted commas. And now for us, mentor is a word we'd put in small m, not a big M, and we wouldn't even think or know necessarily, and why should we, that it referred to an actual character, one who was then imitated, of course, by Athena in the story.
I really wanted to ask you a question actually about the creative side of classics as well, because as you were at Cambridge, you auditioned to be in a production of Oedipus, which took you to Edinburgh Fringe. But at 17 as well, you were Creon in Antigone.
That's right.
So I was wondering, with all of this like academic classics background and not going to university for it, but still loving it and loving the languages, how did acting in those scenarios change the way that you interact with the characters and the world of ancient Greece?
It's a really good question, actually. And I think whenever any actor agrees to be in a production of a Greek play, or more rarely, obviously, a Latin play, the first thing that happens is they meet for a read through is the director will talk about what is the chorus? What should we, what are we going to do with the chorus? Are we going to have masks? And there have been some incredibly successful productions of Euripides and Sophocles and Aeschylus using masks, so there is always this sense, and is it, how much of it is going to use modern acting techniques, which we assume, perhaps arrogantly, that there's more naturalism in our style than there was in the Greek theatrical style, partly because of the nature of the theatres. That if you go to Epidaurus or Epidaurus, you can, it's hard to imagine that you can get away with being too cutely, naturalistic in your style. And also, there is this thing that I think does help when you perform in Greek plays in the modern era. It's not the only way to do it, but to remember that they were communal celebrations, that there was something about it that involved the audience as well as the performers in a ritualistic way, and in a way that touched the knowledge and the community spirit, or whatever one wants to call it, of everybody there. There are ways of doing that can be deeply successful. Quite modern Brechtian ways, if you like, which draw the audience's attention to what they're at. Leafleting them and projections and other things to suggest that what they're watching is not just a play, a closed-off world that you're inquisitively monitoring, but is something that's reaching outwards through the audience, even as it plays, not just in its meaning at the end. But of course, we'll never be that Athenian audience that is so familiar with the story of Oedipus and his daughters and the Seven Against Thebes and the whole cycle there, or so familiar with Medea and Jason and their story, and all the other subjects, many of which we don't even know, because we have to remember that Greek drama we have left to us is the tip of an enormous iceberg, and that sadly the Alexandrian fire and other such disasters have kept from us most of the work of the great three, and so many other works too. But what we do know is that they were valued, they were given prizes each year, and that the big three we have, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, never forgetting Aristophanes, the comic spirit as well. But they won prizes and were famous in their day, and they mattered to Athenian society. They had an importance, and I think it's an importance that is similar to, and I don't want to overdo this because it sounds as if you're trying to be relevant, but it's similar to, let's imagine a mix of a cup final, a coronation, a Taylor Swift concert, and the opening ceremony of the Olympics, all sort of put together. That sort of, oh my God, are you going this year? Sort of feeling about it, and it's going to be about, who's it about this year? And it's, oh my goodness, it's about Philoctetes or whatever. Oh, that's one of my favorite stories. And we'll never quite obviously have that feeling if Bradfield College or someone does a production in their Greek theatre. It's never going to have that much attention paid to it and that much excitement. But if a director can find a way to replicate that, and I think actors, it is a unique experience playing a part in a Greek play. And both of mine were Sophocles, as you said, Creon, who is a pretty unsympathetic character a lot of the time. Obviously, he's the enemy that Antigone must overcome, who is, trying to place in, political necessity over duties of family blood and ties of love and bonds that are, one could argue, are stronger than bonds to the state. And it's a question that has pursued mankind all the way through the communist era. And if you read 1984 and the arguments between O'Brien and Winston Smith in that about duty to self and others and duty to state, you can see that it's not going to go away, and that this play is stunningly relevant in Antigone. And that's just on the political level, on the personal level, on the level of sexual politics as well. It's extraordinarily powerful, and it's so short. That's the other lovely thing people adore about Greek drama, is it doesn't go on too long. It's very short and intense. It obeys those famous Aristotelian unities, so it doesn't flip back in time and place. Or if it does, it's through report, famously in Oedipus, when the witnesses come on and tell the story of the baby Oedipus and what happened to him and so on. But to act them is, the characters know that there's something enormously at stake in what they're doing. In Chekhov, where there is something enormously at stake in what they're doing, it's so ironically placed that the characters make fools of themselves and don't seem to realize what they represent, and it's all in such a sort of miniaturistic reality that it's to me, blissful and perfect drama, and it's the complete opposite of Greek drama, where the characters are aware of who they are. I think that's the masks and so on, and I think that's why you get some of the reworkings of them, like Ennui did an Antigone, I suppose you'd call it, in which, again, he sort of tried to solve this but this interesting question as to how you try and make the story you're telling as important to an audience now as it was to the Greek audience, without being pompous about it or declaratory and over self-conscious. And in Ennui's case, as I recall, I haven't read the play for decades, but he has the cast playing cards with each other, and the chorus says to the audience that he's going to be playing Haemon, who's and he's going to be playing Creon, the uncle, and she is what's called Ismene, the sister, and she's Antigone, or Antigone, and they're going to have this is and he tells the story he almost ruins the story, but doesn't quite, and they're getting ready, and he sort of does that, and I think. And also, the great Italian filmmaker Pasolini made an Oedipus. I think he did two of them. I think he did an Antigone as well. He may have even done the third Oedipus at Colonus. I'm not sure. And he gave him sunglasses and the look of a South American junta. And it was political and dangerous. Every line that was uttered, there was the possibility of death behind it. And I think that's one of the things that we have to make such a leap of imagination. It's not that the Greek myths or the Roman myths or their history or their drama have to touch us. It's we have to touch them. We have to try and imagine what death meant to someone, in Athens in 460. What was it as terrifying and important a stage in life as it is for us, and almost a taboo? We know certain sexual things were less taboo, but we also know that freedom, which is such a part of what we value and is not really an issue in Greek drama or thinking. You don't hear, what is the word, eleftheria, is it? Freedom. You don't hear that as being a primal thing. It's all about the bonds between people, not the shaking of them off. Obviously, slavery, they don't discuss as a particular political issue. They don't question it, which to us is extraordinary. But we forget that post-Enlightenment Europe and the West, and indeed the whole world now to some extent, freedom is it. To America, it's it. To Europe, less so. Maybe we're more concerned with social justice than freedom of speech and assembly and things. But nonetheless, we regard freedom as deeply important. But it's very notable, I think, that it doesn't mean much there isn't a god of freedom in the way there's Lady Liberty, to greet you in New York. It's the god of America and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is a very unclassical world thing. So to use our imagination, is it because they were dolts? They didn't understand. They could break the bonds of kinship, which are something we don't necessarily understand. We have to investigate, and it's an exciting thing to do, to see what kinship, really, blood ties, blood feuds, but also hospitality, xenia, guest friendship, and various other things that are the big capital letter words to the Greeks and the Romans and are not to us. And yet they're the same species as us. If you prick them, do they not bleed, and so on. So it's a thrilling thing to picture oneself in that world, and what one needs to thrive in Athens or in Rome at their height, and what one would have to put up with, what indignities, as we would now regard as indignities, one would have to put up with in order to thrive in that way. And I think it is really important for us to do that, because it allows us to question all the absolute verities on which our civilization is founded and that we assume are natural and normal and right. And I think we like to imagine the Greeks in particular as the masters of logic and justice, with the Areopagitica and the casting of votes as well, and democracy, and it's a reason, and the Apollonian virtues, if you like. But Dodds, I think his name was a great classical scholar who wrote a book that I would recommend anybody to read. It's still fantastically readable, and it's called The Greeks and the Irrational. and it opens up the whole world. And the other one is actually Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy. And Bertrand Russell is very, I won't say down on, but he's quite skeptical about Sophocles and Plato. He doesn't really rate them. He will occasionally say, "What nonsense," when quoting a piece of Plato, but he has an extraordinary instinctive love of Pythagoras and the Orphean rituals and the Eleusinian and all these much more. And this was Russell, the great atheist logician. It's not that he went all fey, but that he actually saw that side of Greece, and I think was trying to correct the imbalance that the Greeks were all harmony and proportion and reason and so on.
Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have today. So thank you so much, Stephen, for sitting down and for joining me today. It means more than I can tell you. And of course, thank you to all of you guys who are watching at home and who continue to support the channel. You guys can find all of Stephen's incredible Greek mythology books linked in the description below, so definitely go and check that out, as well as my longer review of the books and sort of going into the nitty-gritty details and all of that fun stuff. Everything is in the description below. And if you haven't already joined this little nerdy community on this corner of the internet, do not forget to hit the subscribe button whilst you are down there. So with that, I will love you and leave you, and see you next time here on Moan Inc. See you then.